Boker Tov, everybody, and Erev Tov in Yerushalayim or Lunch Food or wherever you might be in Israel or other parts of the world. A pleasure to see everybody, to welcome everybody, and a pleasure to welcome back Shulie Mishkin for another one, which I'm sure will be a riveting, enlightening, informative, exciting series, 6-part series, and always a pleasure. And time we're taking tours on the land of Israel. Come and walk the land. We'll walk it metaphorically, regions of Israel and their stories. So, Bakasha, without further ado, Shulie, it's all yours.
Okay, hi everybody. So this is a little bit of a different series than what we have done up until now. It's instead of going in different time periods, which is really what we've been doing, modern Zionism or Tanakh times or Second Temple times, this is going to be staying in one place, but going through different time periods instead of being in one time period and going through lots of places. So what we're going to do is over the next 6 classes, we're going to explore different parts of the land of Israel. Obviously, coming here is the best, but this is a good preparation for you when you make your trip, or for the people who live here when they want to go on a little trip. So that's the idea. Each week we're going to take a look at a different part of the land, and the place to start, both because it really is the heart of the land of Israel for Jews, certainly, and also because it's my home, is the area of Yehudah, Judah, the heartland of Israel. We are going to be focusing, we'll talk a little bit about Yehudah in the larger sense, right? The tribe of Judah, the area of Judah, but we're going to be focusing on 2 particular places. One is Hebron, right? If you were to say what's the most famous, what's the most important city in Judah, people would say Jerusalem, right? We're not going to do Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a story in and of itself. It needs its own series. So we're going to talk about Hebron, which is, I would say, the second most important city in the land of Judah. And we're going to talk about, like I said, a place close to my heart, which is Gush Etzion, which is the area between Beit Lechem and Hebron, very significant in ancient times, very significant in modern times as well. Okay? And we have a nice old picture here of Kever Rachel, which does not look anything like that today. Anybody who's been there in the last 20 years knows it looks much more like an army base or a fortress. It doesn't really look like this anymore, although when you go inside, you can get a little bit of a feeling of that. But Kever Rachel, Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the heart of the land, the heart of the Avote and the Imahod, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, First Temple, Second Temple. We're going to talk about all of that. Before we get there, let's just do one look, since we are going to be looking throughout the land of Israel. This is a fabulous topographical map. They don't drive using this map, but it's a great map to get a sense of the way the land of Israel is set out, because the topography is really very important. So this was created by somebody named Meir Kahana, not that Meir Kahana, a different one, from the Ofra Field School. And I love it because we're going to be coming back to these themes over and over again of how the land looks, because it's really very, very significant. So perhaps the most important thing for us to notice, and it's going to be important today as well as in the future, is that the land has a spine of mountains. Okay, this doesn't even go all the way down to the mountains of the Negev and Eilat. This is starting really in the center. Next time we'll talk about the Negev and we'll look at a map there. But the mountains go through the center of the country. And we're going to talk about the road that goes on the ridge of these mountains, right? The path of the patriarchs, Derech HaAvot, which goes on what's called Derech Gav Hahar, right? The road that goes along the ridge of the mountains. So you have the mountains that cut through the land of Israel from north to south. Okay, we're going to leave aside the valley for a minute. We'll get back to it. Continues going north in the mountains of the Galilee as well. So that's a very significant topographical feature. Okay, and it determines so many things. Topography is destiny, and we're going to see that as we go along in these 6 weeks. The mountains taper off kind of gently towards the coast on the west, and much more dramatically towards the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley on the east. Okay, now because the land is relatively flat or flatter in the west and the east, that's where major roads went, right? Roads that go what's called the Via Maris or the Derech Hayam, the sea road, right, going up the coast. You also have what's called in ancient times the King's Highway, right, Derech HaMelech. It goes on the other side of the Jordan. That's also important. But how do I get from here to here, because realize that most people in ancient times don't have Eretz Israel as their destination. It's not their final place. Most people in ancient times are going through Eretz Israel, coming from Egypt down here, the major empire, and heading somewhere to the northeast, whether it's to Assyria or Babylonia or the Hittites or whoever there is. We are not the destination. We are a small and insignificant country. So you need to get from one side to the other. How do I do that when I have all these mountains in the way? So what I do is I find a great place to cross. What is that natural place to cross? Emek Yisrael, the Jezreel Valley. Okay, the Jezreel Valley, that's why everybody wants to control it, because it's the best place to cross. And then I can either go through here, right, and cross into the land of Jordan, or I can continue going further north. But this is a major crossing point, right? Any other east-west valleys, like the Elah Valley, like the Ayalon Valley, these are also important, but the most important one is the Jezreel Valley. The other elements of topography here, which are important, we'll come back to them, right? The Golan, right? The Golan Heights, Ramat Golan, with the Chula Valley below it. So that's nice to notice here. The other thing you can notice, which I think he did very nicely in this map, is the mountains of Jordan. All right, the mountains of Jordan are basically paralleling the landscape on the western side, but they're much higher. And that's why you could actually go down to the Dead Sea on a nice summery day in January in the land of Israel and look across and see snow on the mountaintops in Jordan. So that's just kind of a cool thing to know about. Okay, but we are today going to be in this area, what is called Yehuda, Judea. Okay, really, Judea goes all the way to the coast. So we are going to stay in the mountains, but just be aware that it goes all the way to the coast. Okay, that's enough of our nice map. Thank you, Mr. Kahana. And we are going to take a look at Eretz Yehuda. Okay, now obviously, this is a map that divides up the land in the time of the tribes, right? First temple times by second temple times, this has all disappeared. First of all, 10 of the tribes are gone, and the whole division is not applicable anymore. But in first temple times, the division is very important. Now, if you look in Sefer Yoshua, right? If you look in the book of Joshua, you will see the Nachalot, right? That part of the book from chapter 15 or so to 21 ish, right? Very, very boring. Most people skip it. Who really likes it? Tour guides, archaeologists, anyone who wants to understand the way the ancient landscape looked. And if you look in chapter 15, which is one of the longer chapters, you see Nachalat Yehuda, right? Yehuda is very big. It goes all the way from the Dead Sea in the east, all the way down into the Negev desert in the south, all the way out to the coast in the west. I know you're saying it doesn't look like that in the map. 1 second, right? And in the north, it cuts through Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim, of course, is divided between Yehuda and Binyamin. Very important. Now, this map is showing us not de jure, right? The way that the inheritance is laid out, but de facto what really happened. Meaning, what really happened? Along come these people called the Plishtim. They take over the area of the coast. It might say in Sefer Yoshua that Ashdod and Ashkelon and Aza belong to Yehuda. That's too bad, because the Plishtim are there until Churban Bayit Rishon. So it's given to Yehuda, but they're not able to take it. Whereas the other parts, the area of the hills and the area of the desert, they are able to take, right? The other weird anomaly here is the tribe of Shimon. Shimon is kind of swallowed up by Yehuda. Then they move from place to place. They really fulfill the destiny that Jacob promises them on his deathbed, right? Shimon and Bilevi, Achimhem, Achalkem b'Yehuda, va'afazrem b'Yisrael. I'm going to split them up, right? And Levi is split up because he doesn't get an inheritance. Shimon is split up because he has to keep moving, but that's a separate story. But what's important for us here is to understand that Yehuda has area in the mountains as well as in the desert. He controls many different types of landscapes. Anywhere you are in the south of Israel, someone says to you, what Nachala are you in? Good answer is Yehuda. You may not always be right, but chances are good that you're going to be right. Okay. Now, because he has this very variegated land, he also has a lot of products in his economy, right? What does Yaakov say? Again, going back to that blessing. What does he bless Yehuda? Yehuda gets one of the best blessings. Yehuda and Yosef, they compete for the best one. Yehuda chachlile einayim miyayin Beloven shinayim michalav. Okay, you're going to have red eyes from all the wine that you're drinking, and you're going to have nice white teeth, right? Like those toothpaste commercials, from all the milk that you drink. What does that mean? That means you're going to have land that's going to be good for grapes, and that's the area of the mountains, a little bit the desert. You're also going to have land that's going to be good for grazing, for all those goats that are going to give you that nice milk, that's going to give you the nice white teeth. So Yehuda has a very variegated landscape. Also, he really settles very relatively densely. We know from archaeological surveys that were taken before the settlement in the time of Yoshua and afterwards. Before the settlement in the time of Yoshua, you have one settlement per every 200 kilometers. 200 kilometers, one settlement. After the period of settlement, you have one settlement per 30 kilometers. Okay, that's a very big difference. So Yehuda comes in, settles the land of the mountains densely, the desert slightly less densely, and we're going to talk about these areas, mostly about the area of the mountains. Okay, so that's our Yehuda. And let's go from Yehuda and understand this major road that we are on. Okay, part of our story, and this is what we showed on the other big map, is the road that goes through the mountains, right? Today, that road is more or less, and I say more or less very much because of politics, the road has been changed, but Route 60 more or less is the major road through the mountains, and it goes up from Beersheba in the south through Hebron, Gush Etzion, Beit Lechem, Jerusalem, up towards Beit El, Shiloh, Shechem, right? The major road that we have here today. And like I said, we are going to be focusing on Hebron and on the area of Gush Etzion, and what's going on here. And much of this landscape, by the way, when you drive on this road, anyone who's somewhat familiar with this road, you know that the landscape still looks pretty biblical, right? You can still see the terracing, which today is the Arab farmers that do the terracing, but this is a Jewish innovation. How do you make the most of the mountainous land that you have? And the crops that are grown here are, many of them are still the same. They're still growing grapes, they're still growing olives, right? The Shivat Haminim, that's really what thrives here. And just one more word about the path of the patriarchs. The handsome model here is my youngest son, and he is standing by a milestone on the portion of this road that is right outside my house, literally like a 20-minute walk away, okay, right outside of Alon Shvut. And here is our road, right? Our road that goes through the mountains. Now, we call it the path of the patriarchs, Derech HaAvot. Why? Because if you look in the Torah, where are Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov always traveling? Between these cities, right? Avraham comes into the land, he goes to Shechem, from Shechem he goes to Beit El, he continues on towards Chevron and Beersheba. When he has to take Yitzchak to the Akedah, he reverses course, he goes north towards Jerusalem. When Yaakov has to run away from the wrath of Esav, where is he going? He's leaving Beersheba, he's sleeping in Beit El, he's heading out to the northeast. When he comes back 20 plus years later, comes in from Shechem, Beit El, Chevron, Beersheba. It's always that same trajectory. The only time they go off course is when they go down to Egypt, right? Or Yitzchak goes to Gerar. We never hear about them going to the coast. They stay in the mountains. They're shepherds. The mountains are grazing land. Hey, they don't want to be near the major Canaanite civilizations. This is the logical place for them to be. Now, what happens is that about 1,500 years later, along come the Romans, right? And the Romans also want to have a road through the mountains. And they basically are building that road in the same place. And the Roman milestones that have been left scattered around on this road are a great indication. We have Roman milestones all over the country. Romans are great road builders. All roads lead to Rome. But we find these Roman stones on Derech HaAvot, and there are two of them that were found on the one right near Gush Etzion. What's a milestone? A milestone is basically a stone that is for two purposes. Number one, it gives you directional advice. You are X number of Roman miles from the nearest big city. This one that my son is hugging here says 12 miles from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the next big city, right? But it also has a propaganda purpose, okay? Each one of these stones always has the name of the emperor. Who is the emperor? And sometimes you have clusters of these stones, a few together, because Emperor Hadrian may have built the road, right? And then along comes another emperor who Marcus Aurelius, who adds to the road, and he puts up his stone, and the next one puts up his stone. So every time you are going along these roads, over and over and over again, you have this very not so subtle propaganda. This is the Roman emperor. Here's the Roman emperor. Guess who's in charge? It's the Roman emperor. Okay. But for us, it's fascinating because it shows us where those roads are. We are going to come back to Derech Avote and to one of the very exciting discoveries that was made along it. But we're going to start in Chevron because we want to go to Chevron. And we're going to talk about the division of Chevron into the largely Palestinian part, right? Almost all of it is Palestinian, and the much smaller Jewish Israeli part. But that's the part that we are in right here. And I wanted you to get a little bit of a sense of the various places we are going to be visiting. So where will we be visiting? We are going to go up to the top. The problem with this map is it's very flat. We want it to be three-dimensional, right? Tel Rumeda is up on the top of the hill. This is the very beginnings of Hebron, right? It's also called Tel Hebron. This is where the community begins long before Avraham, right? In early Bronze times, right? It's a Canaanite city, and then along comes Avraham. Down at the bottom of the hill is, of course, the most famous site in Jewish Hebron, and that's Marat HaMachpelah, the cave of the patriarchs. But realize this is the bottom of the hill. This is the top of the hill. Very important to understand that. We're going to talk about where the city was at different times. Okay, so we have Marat HaMachpelah, we have Tel Rumeda. Also at the top of the hill, we have the Jewish cemetery, okay, which is not that ancient. The ancient Jewish cemetery is Marat HaMachpelah. The more modern or medieval Jewish cemetery is this one up at the top, okay? We'll also talk a little bit about Beit Hadassah and Avraham Avinu, which is not here, but it's basically right over here. Okay, so those are the places we're going to talk about. Hebron is known as one of the four holy cities, right? You have this great concept of four cities, right? Some of which are very naturally holy, Jerusalem, Hebron. Some of which you say, really? Why is this the holy city, right? The other two are Tzfat and Tveria. Why Jerusalem, Hebron, Tzfat, and Tveria? Because in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period, this is where Jews lived, right? Until they started to spread out and move into other places. These were the cities that had a reliable Jewish community. So they became known as the four holy cities. And Jerusalem and Hebron definitely deserve that title. Tveria and Tzfat also, but to a lesser extent. But Hebron has a Jewish community whenever Jews were allowed to live there for centuries upon centuries. And with that introduction, let's take a look at our timeline for a moment. Okay, so the city of Hebron goes back to before the time of the Avote, obviously, but for Jewish purposes, its importance begins with Avraham, right? The very first purchase of land by a Jew in the land of Israel is Avraham buying the area of Marat HaMachpelah in order to bury Sarah, right? That's our first Jewish ownership of land, and very significant, right? And when we talk about the four holy cities, by the way, each one is connected to a different element, right? In the Greek concept of the world, there are four elements: earth, water, wind, and fire. Hebron is, of course, earth, because we buy earth here, we buy land here, we have a claim to the physical land, and we are buried in the physical land here. So that's the first step here. Then that's what makes Hebron so important. Hundreds of years later, Hebron begins King David's career. It's the first capital before he makes Jerusalem the capital of all of the nation of Israel. Hebron is the capital when he's the king over only Yehuda, and that's very important. Hebron is the capital of Yehuda. Okay, fast forward 1,000 years. Herod builds the building, the monument that we're going to see over the cave of Machpelah. In the Roman Byzantine period, 4th to 7th centuries, we have flourishing Jewish communities in the Chevron Hills, presumably in Hebron as well, but we don't have archaeology from there. But we're talking about places like Susia and Maon and Carmel. Okay? With the Crusader conquest, Jews are exiled from Hebron, just like they're exiled from Jerusalem, just like they're exiled from almost everywhere. And yet somehow during this Crusader period, the Rambam visits Hebron. We have a beautiful description of how he comes to Hebron to pray at Kever Avote, and he commemorates that day forever after as a holiday. When the Crusaders are kicked out by the Mamluks in the 13th century, the Jews return to the city, and that's when they move to the bottom, right? Remember, they had been on the top, now they're on the bottom. They buy land, they build the Avraham Avinu synagogue, they establish the new cemetery at the top of the hill. In the 19th century, Chabad greatly strengthens the community in Hebron. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, Hebron Jewish community is booming. It's growing. It grows beyond the bounds of the Hebron Jewish community today. The first Hadassah clinic in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, the building is built earlier, but then when Hadassah is formed, it becomes a health clinic. Yeshivat Slobodka comes to Hebron, and just as Hebron is really thriving and at its peak, you have the terrible, terrible story of the 1929 Arab riots, the massacre of the Jews, and the essential effective end of the Jewish community in Hebron until 1967. In 1967, Israel comes back. We'll tell the story of how the Jewish community is reestablished in Hebron, first Kiryat Arba, then in Hebron itself, in 1980. Another very important, very tragic moment, right? Dividing moment is in 1994 with the terrible attack. Baruch Goldstein opens fire on Muslims in Marat HaMachpelah, and at that point the cave is no longer open to everybody. I'm sure there are people here who remember when the entire full cave was open to both Jews and Muslims together, and that all comes to an end in 1994. And in 1997, we have the Chevron Agreement that divides up Hebron into the Jewish areas and the Palestinian areas. Terror attacks in 2002, Beit Menachem in Tel Rumeda, official Jewish building as opposed to only caravans in 2005. I could have added to this timeline. This was really enough, but this is a very important picture as a consequence of the Oslo Accords, right, in the 90s, when Israel withdraws from Palestinian cities, right, from very important cities that have a very strong Jewish history, but didn't have a lot of Jews living in them in the 1990s, Shechem, right, and the areas around Ramallah and Jenin and Beit Lechem, right, there are certain places that are, because of the Jews who were living there and because of the importance of the history there, are continue in Jewish hands. Kever Rachel, of course, not settlement in Beit Lechem, but Kever Rachel, and Hebron. Hebron, because it has this very strong kind of a diehard Jewish community, was not given over fully to the Palestinians. And there was this very complicated agreement that was drawn up in 1997, the Chevron Agreement with Bibi Netanyahu, who was prime minister then, as he is now for probably not that much longer. We'll see. But here's our Chevron Agreement. Now, our Chevron Agreement is a fascinating agreement. The yellow, H1, okay, that's Area A, that's 85% of Hebron is given to the Palestinians. H2, 15% is given to Israel, but of that 15% is under Israeli control. Only 3% is Jewish settlement. So essentially, Jews can only live in 3% of Hebron. And when you go into the Jewish community of Hebron, and I'm sure there are people here who have been there, it's a tiny portion of the larger city, right? And when you hear Palestinians talking about how it's so unfair, the Jews have taken over and there's apartheid and they limit settlement in Hebron, this is looking only at H2 and only at a very small part of H2. If you go up on a rooftop in Tel Rumeda and you see into Palestinian Hebron, it's massive, right? It's enormous. It's an enormous city. It's a thriving city. And the only parts that are difficult for Arabs is that small 3% of H2 where people choose to live because they don't really want Jews to have that 3%. But in terms of the numbers, there are about 160,000 Arabs living in Hebron. There are, give or take, depending on if you count students or not, 800 to 1,000 Jews. Okay, I'll just say those numbers again: 160,000, 800. It's a very big disparity. But let's go back to the history. right outside of Chevron, north of Chevron, we have the site which is called Elonei Mamre. Okay? Elonei Mamre, if you know your Torah, right? Abraham's buddies, the brothers Mamre, Einar, Eshkol, and Mamre, very important in the time of Avraham. Second Temple times, also an important site. We've actually found Herodian walls that are here. There's a large mikveh here, but in Bar Kokhba times, when the Romans completely defeat the Jews in Judea and establish, first of all, murder many, many people, but a huge slave market. The slave market is here in Elonei Mamre, as well as a pagan Roman temple. And this kind of takes away the appeal of Elonei Mamre for Jews. It's a terrible story. Slaves, pagans, we don't want it. It doesn't have any importance to us anymore, but it does still remain important for Christians. And in Byzantine times, there's a church here. There's a tree that they point out as Eshel Avraham, right? The tree that Avraham plants. Highly doubtful that it is the same tree, but that's what they point out. And in Crusader times, they decided they didn't like this site anymore. And instead, they moved to the top of the hill to a place called Moscovia. This is where there's a Russian church built much later. And they move the tree, right? Theoretically, they don't actually move the tree, right? But they pick a tree and they say, this is the tree of Eshel Avraham. Again, significant for Christians, much less for Jews. What is very significant for Jews is Tel Rumeda. Right. So if you go to the top of the hill, this is what I showed you guys in the map before. If you go to the top of the hill today, there is a building that is built there, Beit Menachem. It took a very, very long time. It took about 20 years of persuading the government to allow this building to be built. Before that, Jews were living up here, but only in caravans. They had to get official permission. But once they were allowed to officially build the building, they were able to do an archaeological excavation here, a very limited one. Now, archaeology in Hebron is a fascinating and depressing story. Okay, why fascinating? Very obvious, right? You have thousands of years of history here. There must be tons to discover. Why depressing? Because of everything that happens in Hebron and how much international attention is given to it and how much tension there is between the Arab and the Jewish population. There is very little archaeology that is allowed to happen. So when it does happen, it's very thrilling. And when they were building the foundations, laying the foundations for this building of Beit Menachem, they were able to excavate underneath. And just the tiny excavations that they did here are amazing, because what did they discover? And I'll point out a few things. The picture doesn't really do it justice. You really have to come here and see it. Okay. But you can see the remains of the city wall. Okay, and we actually have two layers of the city wall. We have an early one, the early Bronze Age, which is 4,000 years ago, okay, give or take a little bit more. And we have a second wall. The city expands a little from Middle Bronze. Okay, Avraham is late early Bronze. Okay, so we have the city wall and we have a road that leads out of the city wall, right? Going this way, going, well, actually, yeah, going into the city, but you have a road both ways. Now, there's a street out here. The street, they have not excavated underneath it. But if you were to excavate underneath it, chances are good that since you're by the city wall, you would find what's right by the city wall, the gate, right? The Sha'ar Ha'ir. And we know that Avraham buys the Machpelah cave. Who are the witnesses? Kol Ba'ei Sha'ar Iro. Everybody who is hanging out at the gate, because people hung out at the gate in the old days. So the gate of the city, the walls of the city, and deeper in, which you can only see on the edge of the picture here, we have a number of different things. Okay, we have a grain silo that goes back to the time of Yoshua. We have a 4-room house. You can see the pillars kind of in the distance here that go back to the time of Chizkiyahu. We can date it by the handles that are found here. All of this in a very, very limited space. So you can imagine how much more there would be to discover if you could excavate more. An excavation that was done recently that was kind of kept under wraps for a very long time because they didn't want any international interference is a little bit up the hill from Tel Rumeda. And that's what you see here. And you can see these beautiful, beautiful preserved mikvahs here, right? Mikvaot, clearly showing us that there is settlement here in Second Temple times, because these are Second Temple style mikvahs. So really there would be much more to discover if we could only have a free hand to excavate. That's Tel Rumeda, the ancient part of Hebron on the top of the hill. Now, just to talk about this for 1 second, okay, in ancient times, meaning in the time of Avraham, people lived at the top of the hill and they buried at the bottom of the hill. You never bury in the same place that you live, right? Jews don't anyway, right? So they lived at the top and they buried at the bottom. And that's why Avraham buys the land at the bottom, because that's where you bury people. In medieval times, for various reasons, this flips, okay? And people start to live at the bottom of the hill and to bury at the top of the hill. And that's why the ancient Jewish cemetery here is not that ancient. It doesn't go back to the time of Abraham. It goes back to the Middle Ages, when Jews start to come back here in Mamluk times, and especially after the expulsion from Spain. They buy a piece of land at the top of the hill. The land is cheap, and this is where they establish the cemetery. And it's a very important cemetery because there was an ideal throughout history of Lihikaver im Yishenei Chevron. I want to be buried. I want to sleep buried with the sleepers of Hebron. Okay, it's always this idea, and it's not just Jews. Christians do this. Muslims do this. Somebody important, somebody holy is buried somewhere. Everybody wants to be buried nearby. So the Jewish cemetery of Hebron, maybe not as important as Har HaZeitim, but it's definitely a very important cemetery. And you have people like Rav Chizkiah Medini, like the Chida, like Rabbi Eliyahu Mani, right? These are medieval important Jewish scholars buried in Chevron. Chevron Cemetery is odd. It had a tradition that they did not mark the graves. All right, that was the shita. They just didn't mark the graves. There were pinkasim, there were notebooks that the Chevra Kadisha kept. Everybody knew where people were buried, but the graves themselves did not have headstones, most of them, and were not marked. Now, this became a tragic situation when in 1929, along with massacring the Jews, the Arabs rampaged through the cemetery and destroy a lot of the cemetery. How do you restore it? How do you know who's buried where? And there was an immigrant from the former Soviet Union who comes as one of the first settlers in Hebron, Professor Ben-Zion Tavger, and he takes upon himself the project of restoring the cemetery. Right, looking through the records of the Chevra Kadishas and figuring out where people were and restoring the graves and marking the graves, an enormous project, and he takes it on, and it's the reason we know where things are in the cemetery today. The graves of the Jews who were murdered in 1929, also, the Arabs desecrated them throughout the years that they were there. And this, on the picture on the right here, is a memorial that it's a kever achim, right? It's a communal grave because the graves themselves were desecrated. One of the famous parts of the cemetery, it's a little bit higher than the rest of the cemetery, is the Chabad section. Okay, Chabad section has an interesting story. In this Chevron Agreement in 1997, this section was almost given over to the Arabs. The Chabad community throughout the world used all the pull that they had, which is a lot of pull, in order to keep this Chabad section in Israeli hands, and it was kept in Israeli hands. Chabad, like I mentioned before, in the early 1800s, they start to come to Hebron. They strengthen the Jewish community in Hebron. The most famous Chabadnik in Hebron is the person whose grave you see here, Menucha Rachel Slonim. Menucha Rachel Slonim lives a long and full life. She's born in 1798. She is the daughter of the second Chabad Rebbe. She is the granddaughter of Rav Shneur Zalman, of the Admor HaZaken, of the original, the founder of Chabad, the Baal HaTanya. And she lives from 1798 to 1888. She lives a long, full life. She comes to Hebron as a relatively young woman, and with her husband, right? Rav Yaakov Slonim, and they become, first of all, a very important family in the city of Hebron. The Slonim family were royalty in the Jewish community of Hebron, and she becomes like the grandmother. Jews come to her for blessings, Arabs come to her for blessings. She's a very, very beloved and respected figure in the community. So that's her grave here. And another important grave. There are a lot of fascinating graves in the cemetery, but I want to show you this one. And you can see it says Avraham Yedidia ben Sarah uBaruch Nakshon. Sarah and Baruch Nakshon were among the first who came back to try and settle in Hebron in 1968. And the army and the government didn't allow them to settle in Hebron. They established the settlement of Kiryat Arba. Only 10 years later, 12 years later, is the Jewish community in Hebron proper settled. Okay? Avraham and Sarah Nakshon have a baby, and they name him, Sarah and Baruch Nakshon have a baby, and they name him Avraham, as befits a baby born near the renewed Jewish community next to Hebron. Unfortunately, this baby dies as an infant. Now, at this point, the Jewish cemetery in Hebron is off limits to Jews because Hebron is off limits to Jews. And Sarah Nachshon decides that in this tragedy of losing her child, she is going to reclaim the cemetery. And she sets out with her baby, this is in 1975, for the Jewish cemetery of Hebron. They leave Kiryat Arba, it's a whole group, and she's carrying this corpse in her hands, and they get to the soldiers who are standing outside of Hebron, and they say, we're going to the Jewish cemetery. And they say, we're sorry, you can't go to the Jewish cemetery. And she says, I'm going, this is my baby. I'm going to bury this child in the Jewish cemetery in Hebron. And the soldiers can't withstand that. They can't. She has this grieving mother, and they let her through. And she comes and she digs a grave for her son. And she says, thousands of years ago, Avraham came here and claimed Hebron for the Jewish people by burying his wife, Sarah. I, Sarah, reclaim Hebron by burying my son, Avraham. And it's an incredibly powerful moment. And from that point on, the Jewish cemetery is renewed and is restored. Another very significant place in Hebron is the Avraham Avinu Synagogue. Again, this is the new community down at the bottom. The Spanish exiles who come, someone named Rav Malkiel Ashkenazi comes. They bring a Torah from Spain. They build the synagogue, of course, named after Avraham Avinu. Very, very beautiful synagogue. It becomes the main synagogue in Hebron. Destroyed in the riots of 1929. We'll see the pictures. And the same Ben Zion Tavger, who restored the cemetery, his next project was to restore the Beit Knesset. And today it's a beautiful, very small, but very beautiful Beit Knesset that actually has in its own a Torah scroll that was brought from Spain with the Jews when they were expelled. As we said, late 19th, early 20th century, the city begins to expand. This beautiful building on the right is built, and it eventually becomes the first Hadassah clinic in the land of Israel. And today it's called Beit Hadassah, and it's where the Jews move back to and start to restore the Jewish community of Hebron. The Slobodka Yeshiva. Okay, this is the altar of Slobodka in the picture here, and these fellows, these sharp fellows in the suits and the hats, they are the yeshiva bachers of Slobodka, and the yeshiva is established here, Yeshivat Hebron. But all of this comes crashing to a halt August 24th, 1929. Rumors about desecration of Jews destroying things on the Temple Mount, and Arabs go wild all over the country, and we have terrible, terrible riots in Jerusalem and in Sfat, and we're going to see in Gush Etzion and all over, but particularly in Hebron. There were Arabs who had been living alongside their Jewish neighbors for decades and who protected them, and there were those who turned against them. You really had both kinds of stories, but terrible, terrible stories. A total of 69 Jews who are killed, synagogues desecrated, the cemetery desecrated, terrible, terrible things. Many Jews took refuge in Eliezer Slonim's house. Remember the Slonim family, and he had a very good relationship with his Arab neighbors. And the Arab rioters come to the house and they say to him, if you give us the Ashkenazi Jews, we will spare the Sephardi Jews, because the Arabs had a better relationship with the Sephardi Jews. And of course, Eliezer Slonim refuses, and all of them, including him, are massacred. The British who are here, the High Commissioner John Chancellor comes and is terribly dismayed, and he writes this whole this whole letter about how terrible it is. But ultimately, there's a commission of inquiry, and the Jews are essentially blamed. You started trouble at the Western Wall. You started trouble on the Temple Mount. What did you expect? Essentially, the Jewish community comes to an end at that point. Even though Jews are still allowed to live there till 1948, there are almost no Jews in Hebron, and the return only happens in 1967, okay, 1968. June 67, of course, is the Six-Day War. Rav Shlomo Goren comes to Marat HaMachpelah. Jews are allowed back into Marat HaMachpelah. They petition, they want to move back to Hebron. The government doesn't give permission. What happens? In Pesach of 1968, Rav Moshe Levinger goes and rents out an Arab hotel in Hebron, puts an ad in the newspaper, come spend Pesach in Hebron. And after Pesach is over, they don't leave. They stay on, and they basically are challenging the government to say to them, what are you going to do with us? And they're at an impasse until finally the government says, all right, you're allowed to stay, but not in Hebron. You can live next door in the army base that's there. You can establish a community there. And what happens is they establish what eventually becomes Kiryat Arba. Okay, here's Miriam Levinger and Sarah Nakshon, who we mentioned before. Here's Baruch Nakshon, who is a famous artist. But by 1979, they want to be in Hebron proper. At this point, it's the women and the children that take over, and the women and the children move into Beit Hadassah, the abandoned Beit Hadassah. And again, it's a standoff with the government. They stay there. They are not allowed to leave. The army protects them. If they leave, they can't come back. And after a year of being there, when there's a terror attack and 6 yeshiva students are killed, Menachem Begin's government allows them to settle in Hebron. And that's a lot of the story of Hebron, is action reaction as opposed to a plan that's thought out from the beginning. The Me'ara, right? The Me'ara is, of course, the centerpiece, the reason people are in Hebron. Like we said, up until 1994, it was jointly used by Jews and Muslims. After the Baruch Goldstein massacre, the government came to a decision that there are 2 separate sections. There's a Jewish entrance, and that's at the top, and many of us are familiar with it, coming in through here, and you can go into 2 sections, the Avraham section, Avraham and Sarah and Yaakov and Leah. The other side, which you can see from the stairs, the Jewish section, is the Muslim entrance, right? It's all very close one to the other, but the 2 don't meet, okay? And they get the larger, because the Jews got 2, they got 1, they got the larger Ulam, the Ulam Yitzchak. And there are 10 days a year where Jews have the entire place to themselves. Yom Kippur, Parshat Chayei Sarah, Chol Hamoed, and there are 10 other days a year where the Muslims have the whole place to themselves, right? Eid al-Adha, Eid al-Fitr, and that's the agreement, and it has mostly held and not caused problems, but of course it's very tragic because this is a place that is really holy to everybody. We will not read through the story. It is a story that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, of the bargaining of Avraham and Efron the Chiti, with Efron is a very Middle Eastern story, right? Here, take it for free. No, I have to pay it to you. No, take it for free. I have to pay you. Okay, give me 400 shekel silver, which is a crazy, exorbitant price. Avraham, of course, is expected to bargain. He doesn't bargain. He takes out his wallet. He pays the money right away. And the whole thing passes to Avraham, and he buries his wife. And of course, we know that the following generations bury there as well. Who is buried here? So according to the Torah, Avraham and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah. Rachel, of course, buried on the road in Kever Rachel. According to the Medrash, we add in another couple, Adam and Chava. According to the Medrash, we also add in Esav's head. Okay, the Arabs go with the 3 patriarchs as well, but they, instead of saying Esav's head, they actually say this is Kever Yosef. Hey, now we do not believe that because we say Yosef is buried in Shechem. It says it very clearly in Sefer Yoshua, as well as in Sefer Breshit. But the Arabs see Yosef as being buried here. But the other 3 couples are agreed on by Jews, Christians, Muslims. Everybody agrees that these are the patriarchs and matriarchs, and very holy to them. Isaac swapped out by Ishmael, but definitely Avraham, very important. Okay, Ulam Yitzchak, which is off limits to Jews most of the time, very large. And here's where it's just interesting to see it because we don't usually get to see it. This is the largest part of the various rooms that are here. And it also is the place where you have an entrance to go down underneath. Now, since Jews came back in 67, there has been a desire to see what's underneath. The building on the outside, let's just take a quick look at that for a second, right? This building, this very famous picture, this is a building built probably by Herod because it looks a lot like what we found by the Western Wall and other areas near the Temple Mount, meaning 2,000 years ago. But this is not the caves. This is not the graves. Where are the graves? The graves are deep under the ground. Where exactly under the ground? So, very famously in 1968, you couldn't excavate here because it's holy to everybody. But Jews found an opening over here in the Ulam Yitzchak. It was a very, very narrow opening. They were able to send a young girl, a 12-year-old girl, down, Michal, down to explore. Very intrepid girl, because this is kind of scary, right? And she went down, and what did she discover, which is actually fascinating? A cave within a cave, right? Here's an inner cave. Here's the outer cave. It's exactly how Chazal describe it. What is machpelah? Ma'arat ha-machpelah. Kefel. It's double, either double because you are two couples, right? Couples as opposed to singles, right? But also double because of a cave within a cave. And that's exactly what she saw. In the 80s, they discovered a larger opening that they were able to go down, and they were able to see more. Of course, all this had to be done very secretly without the knowledge of the Arabs who were there. And they were able to discover Byzantine pottery and graves, which tells you that people kept on burying there hundreds of years later. So it's really a very fascinating thing. What did the graves of the Avote and the Imahod actually look like? That's a great question. We know from that time period, we have other graves. They don't look like the graves in later First Temple times, which are niches where the bodies were laid out. They are what are called shaft graves. You can see it in the drawing here very nicely, right? About 1.5 to 2 meters deep, right? Sometimes with chambers on the bottom. We found lots of these. People are buried standing up, more or less. And this goes back to the time of the Avot, 3,500 to 4,000 years. And we have these kinds of graves that were discovered outside of the building of Ma'arat HaMachpelah. So it really does tell us that this is a grave site that goes back very, very far. All right. Now, as I said before, holy to Jews, holy to Muslims, holy to Christians. And that's why when you come inside, you'll see inscriptions in Arabic. When the Mamluks come in the 13th century, they forbid Jews to enter the tomb. Jews have to pray outside on what was called, they can only go up to the 7th step leading into the entrance. Today, Jews have returned, but it's a site that is very tragic, really, because it's a site that really should be something that we could all have our shared common heritage, and it's a site instead that has caused many, many, many battles and many fights. One other grave that's nearby, that unlike the graves at the top of the hill that are considered to be biblical graves, there's a Kever Ruth, Kever Yishai. Very unlikely that those are real, because as we said, people buried at the bottom of the hill and not at the top. But this is another grave at the bottom of the hill. And this is a story that we hear in Tanakh, and we have a tradition about the grave here, and that's the Kever of Avner ben Ner. Avner ben Ner, the general of King Saul. Okay, his top general after King Saul dies, is killed in battle with the Philistines. Avner becomes kind of the de facto ruler. Saul's son Mephibosheth is the ruler, but he's very weak. And Avner comes to parley with David in Chevron to say, I will bring you the rest of the tribes if I, have some good place here, right? We will unify. Yoav, David's general, is very suspicious of this, and he goes and he murders Avner. He assassinates him. And David, of course, says, I'm not having anything to do with this. I want to be a unifier. This is all on your head, Yoav. And he makes a big state funeral and makes a kinah and buries Avner in Hebron, right? Even though Avner clearly is belonging to Binyamin, he buries him in Chevron. So we have Avner's grave here as well. It's on the Muslim side. Sometimes you can get permission to go see it. It's a neat thing to see. Okay, we in the time that we have left, we are going to take a look at Gush Etzion. It's a shame it's not so much time, because it's really my favorite place to talk about, but still, we have time. Don't worry. We will be fine. So let's take a look at Gush Etzion. Gush Etzion begins in this area here by Kfar Etzion, between Beit Lechem here and Hebron down here. Okay, today Gush Etzion this is central Gush Etzion over here, but we also have eastern Gush Etzion to call. We're not going to talk about that. Interesting, but not our story for today. But classic Gush Etzion, let's call it that, is between Beit Lechem and Chevron. Okay, it is a place that has a history that goes far, far back. We have evidence here of settlement in First Temple times, in Second Temple times, many, many, many Jewish communities here up until the Bar Kokhba revolt. Okay, when of course this is all destroyed and Jews go north to the Galilee. But we have so much evidence of settlement here, a lot from Second Temple times, although some from First Temple times as well. From Second Temple times, we have very clear evidence of settlement. We have, remember, our path of the patriarchs. We have a major mikvah on it because this is the derech ole regel. This is the route of pilgrimage where people are traveling to the temple. They need to purify themselves. They go to the mikvah. We have parts of the ancient aqueduct because Gush Etzion was the water source for Jerusalem. So we have the Biar aqueduct, which has since been cleaned out and became a tourist attraction. We have one of Herod's palaces in eastern Gush Etzion, Herodian, and so many other places. Come on a tour to Gush Etzion, very worthwhile. Okay, but because of all sorts of historical circumstances, Jews did not settle in Gush Etzion and did not live there. It wasn't called Gush Etzion, right? In the mountainous area of Yehuda. They came back to Hebron, but they didn't come back to these small communities. When Zionism begins in the late 19th century, Jews are settling in other places in the Jezreel Valley, along the coast, not in the mountains, until the 1920s, when Jews start to say, but wait a second, this is the historic area of the Jews. This is where we should settle. And there are 3 attempts to settle here. 1920s, ultra-Orthodox community called Migdal Eder. They purchase land, they establish themselves, but with 1929 riots, they have to leave. 1930s, and this is where we get the name Gush Etzion. This gentleman here, Shmuel Holtzman, very interesting entrepreneur, went to Australia as gold mines, a very interesting guy. He buys land here and he calls it after himself. He's Mr. Holtzman. Holtz in German means wood. Etz in Hebrew means wood or tree. So he calls his land Gush Etzion, Kfar Etzion. Mr. Holtzman's Kfar, Mr. Holtzman's village. And the whole area becomes called Gush Etzion. It has something to do with Zion or Zionism. It really is about Mr. Holtzman. Okay. And he settles here, he buys land here. I am emphasizing the buying land because this is land that was legally purchased, not stolen from anyone, as our friends in social media like to say. But again, in the Arab riots of the mid-30s, the community here has to leave. But in the 40s, they are able to come back. 4 communities ultimately, 3 religious, Kfar Etzion, Tzurim, Masua, Yitzchak, 1 secular, Rivadim. And these are founded and they manage to thrive despite very difficult conditions, but they manage to thrive. Many of the members of these communities are Holocaust survivors. Okay, and that's a fascinating thing. They come here, sometimes the last remnant of their families. They come to look for refuge here. And we have this very powerful scroll of planting, Megillat HaNeti'ah, that is written after planting trees right around the time of Tu B'Shvat, right? The 26th of Shvat, 1944. Listen to what they write. It's so powerful. 26th of Shvat, 5704, the 5th year of the Second World War, a year after our ascent to Kfar Etzion, we, the members of Kfutzat Avraham of the Poem Mizrahi, approach to plant fruit and forest trees in Kfar Etzion to fulfill what is written in the Torah. And when you come to the land, you will plant. The earth was not created for chaos, but to be settled. At the time when rivers of our brothers' blood are spilled like water and the world is drowning in blood, 1944, we came here to build and plant and strike deep roots in the mountains of Judah. With these plantings, we open a door to our redemption and salvation. We were rootless in the exile. That rootlessness was a terrible disease of our nation while in a strange land. We need roots. We need to have a strong hold in our homeland. That is the work we are doing in this place. And they are rebuilding themselves while they are rebuilding the mountains of Yehuda. This is one of the original buildings, the German monastery, and today it's still the building. It's where the historical museum of Kfar Etzion is, and the audiovisual center. The communities more or less thrive, but in 1947 there's a great blow because in partition, Gush Etzion is put into the part that is going to be given over to the Arabs. Okay, and the decision is made right once the War of Independence begins, the day after partition is voted. Ben-Gurion basically says, whatever we get in the war, we keep. We're not going to go back to these lines. But yet, Gush Etzion is in a very vulnerable position, okay, between the very hostile Arab communities of Bethlehem and Chevron. Actually, the local Arabs, mamash local, like right next door to us, are actually more friendly and more sympathetic, but the larger communities are not. And they have to make this very terrible decision, right? Which is, should they stay and defend their communities here, even though they are at a great disadvantage? There's one road going in and out. It's not like Gush Etzion today that there are many options of how to get here. There's one road. The road is besieged, and they are in a very vulnerable position. Should they stay here, protect that road, protect their communities, or should they kind of pack up and help the defense in Jerusalem? And you can see here the vulnerability, right? Here we are in Kfar Etzion, just annotated again, right? Here's Kfar Etzion. Here, of course, is Beit Lechem, Hebron down at the bottom, but look at all these other Arab villages all around, not friendly in any way. Okay, they're in a very vulnerable place. What should they do? The decision is finally made in January of 48, which is that the mothers and the children will be evacuated, and they're actually taken in for the first early months before they have a place to go. You could see this not very Jewish statue here. They're taken in by the Ratisbon Monastery in Jerusalem, which is located in Rehavia of today, and that's where they go. The mothers and children are evacuated. The men, the single women, stay behind. There are some mothers who stay behind as well. This is one of them, Tzipora Rosenfeld. She's a Holocaust survivor. She and her husband, both survivors. They meet, they marry, they have a child, but she doesn't want to leave. She's been running. She doesn't want to run anymore. And she leaves her child, Yossi. She sends him to Jerusalem, and she stays behind. And the two of them are both killed in the final battles. And the child is brought up by the other members of the kibbutz. The story of Lamed Hey is a very important story, but I'm going to skip it because we're a little short on time. Maybe we'll tell it a different time. But the battles of these communities become worse and worse. The first three communities, Masuot Yitzchak, Revadim, and Ein Surim, fall. And on the 4th of Iyar, right, the 13th of May, the final stand, Kfar Etzion, falls to the Arabs, locals, plus the Jordanians. They are told to come out. They surrender. They're told to come out and to be photographed, and instead they are all massacred. And this is a terrible, terrible moment for the Yishuv. And it's one of the reasons why Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, is on the 4th of Iyar, the day before the state is declared, not only also to connect it, the sacrifices with independence, but it's one of the reasons, because this was a terrible, terrible moment in the life of the young state. And this is just commemorated by everyone. The children, the mothers become very, very close, but there are no fathers to rebuild. The three other communities do rebuild. Masuot Yitzchak, Revadim, and Ein Surim rebuild within a year. Okay, not far from Ashdod. Kfar Etzion doesn't rebuild, and every year on Yom HaZikaron, on Memorial Day, they go to the edge of Israeli territory, because of course Gush Etzion becomes part of Jordan between 48 and 67, and they look for the one landmark on the horizon, which of course is this massive ancient tree. Okay, the lone oak, the lone tree. And that's the one thing you could see and the one thing you can identify in the distance, and that's how they can see what's left of their homes. On the third day of the 6-day war, Gush Etzion, along with Hebron, along with the entire Yehuda and Shomron, is taken by Israel. A day earlier, one of the children of Kfar Etzion is killed in the major battle that takes place on Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem. His name was Meir Shnur. And when the war is over, at the Shloshim, right, at the 30-day memorial service, the friends all gather and they say, we have to return. The land is ours now. We have to return. And they petition the government already in July of 67. Nothing has been opened up except for Jerusalem. Nobody is allowed. Chevron is not allowed. And of course, any of the other areas in Yehuda and Shomron. But the children of Kfar Etzion go to the government and they say, we want to come back. We want to come back. This is our home. We were forced out of it. And the government gives them permission to return. In September 67, The children of Kvaratzion come back. This is front page news everywhere. And partly it's connected to the deep impact that this massacre had. The children of Kvaratzion return. A year later, there's the beginnings of what becomes eventually Yeshivat Har Etzion, which is the picture you can see here above. They start out in Kvaratzion, but soon after 1970, they moved to establish a new community, Alon Shvut, the Oak of Return, named after the tree. The yeshiva is very, very connected to the rebirth of Gush Etzion. And today, it's a thriving and beautiful community that I am very happy to be part of. So these are some nice children by the caves leading down to the mikvah, and by another one of the natural springs here, and that is our Gush Etzion story. So let's see what questions we have here. A few questions or comments, and if people have other ones. Yes, 3% of the total, right? Maybe I didn't say that so clearly, right? Hebron is divided 85% in the Palestinian story, 15% in Israeli territory. Of that whole 100%, only 3% belongs to the Jews, right? Did that make sense? Right? 3% of the 100. Would I please clarify from where the Arabs are that occupy H1 in Hebron and when they came? So there's been an Arab community in Hebron for many, many years, right? Certainly at least since the Mamluks, which is the 13th century. I won't say that all Arabs in Hebron are from there, but are from then, but there are many that do trace themselves back. Hebron is very much, the Arab Hebron is very much a, there are major clans, right? Chamulot. There are certain families that have been important in the city for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they really run everything. By the way, there's been more progress in Hebron. As much as the riots and everything a few weeks ago really shook us up, thank God there's a lot of progress in a lot of ways, and Jews and Arabs are working together more in Hebron than they ever used to, and that's a very positive thing. The other thing I will say about the Arabs in Hebron and in Yehuda and Shomron in general, in the land of Israel in general, there is a suggestion, because we know when the Muslims would come to places, they would often convert people, or people would choose to be converted because it was better to be a Muslim. And there's a suggestion that quite a lot of the Arabs in the land of Israel were Jews. Right, going back, if you go back to the 8th, 7th century. Avraham Avinu started out as Sephardic. What is it today? Today, I'm guessing that whoever shows up to daven, because that's how it usually works in Israel, is what it is. But I don't know. I don't know. But the original shul was definitely Sephardic. The grave above, right? So the grave above Tel Rumeda, this is what I said before. They say Kever Ruth Vishai. It is unlikely for many reasons. The most significant to me is what we said. In Tanakh times, the graves are at the bottom of the hill. This is at the top of the hill where people are living. You wouldn't bury somebody there. The other reason it doesn't make sense is Ruth and Yishai are not from Hebron. Ruth and Yishai are from Beit Lechem. Why would you bury them in Hebron? Right? So yes, I do not find that convincing, I will say. I don't think that I think you have to debunk the things that are not true so that people don't say that the things that are true are not true. Does that make sense the way I said that? Right. The most disturbing when the Muazzin calls Allah Akbar, yes, but that's the whole, that's everywhere in Israel. Early 1970, when they live in the police station and on the pretext it will only be a yeshiva. Yes, thank you. There's back and forth, right? What is the rest of the enormous building of the Ma'ara? It's actually, if you've been inside, you know that a lot of it is not really a building, right? The part where the Jews are, where the Avraham and the Yaakov rooms are, there's a very large courtyard in the middle. But it's basically all pieces of the original, the site that goes back 2,000 years. Was it used differently? The space was divided differently in the time of Herod? Yes, I'm sure it was. Barbara says, my first cousin is Ruthie Damaso. You'll tell me later. Is Gush Etzion always guarded from attack at present? Well, there's a lot of soldiers who hang out here, and we have an army base across the street, so we hope for the best. How far is Ma'ale Adumim? So if you go to eastern Gush Etzion, there isn't a road that goes directly, but by Jeep, it's actually not far at all. By road, it takes about 45 minutes on a real road today. Where did the founders of Gush Etzion come from originally? So you do have Jews who were able to get out. and many of them came afterwards, by the way. The communities are founded in 1943, but that's not the end. People are coming afterwards as well. So they are coming from Kfutzat Avraham, if I'm remembering correctly, is Hungary. I may be wrong. I would have to check. I should know that because the street I live on is Kfutzat Avraham, but I will check it for you and tell you next week. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Anybody else have other questions?
I believe that the Avraham Avinu shul does daven is still Sephardic, basically, unless people come there and form their own minyan. But normally, when they have regular minyanim there, it is Sephardic.
Okay, thank you. Because it's interesting because I don't know. I mean, today it's in an enclave where Jews are living, right? That whole Avraham Avinu, there's a whole neighborhood there, and I'm curious how many are Sephardim and how many are Ashkenazim. But thank you, that's helpful.
Okay, thank you, Shulie. Always interesting and informative. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next week. This evening at 8:30, Rabbi Noah Chezis from Young Israel of Sharon, Mass. will be giving our Parsha shir. He was previously the assistant rabbi at Sher Shemaim here in Toronto, and then was the head of JLIC, him and his wife JLIC at Yale University. So everybody's invited this evening, 8:30 p.m. Parsha. I'll be giving, please God, the Pirkei Avot shir tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern time. And Rabbi Liebtag kicks off next week with part 2 in Sefer Dvarim Sunday morning at 11:15. We look forward to learning with you. Everybody should be well. And like I say, if everybody were to invite one friend to try one class, the Torah Motion, that would be wonderful. That's the greatest thing you can do. Just let somebody who doesn't know about us and invite them to come to one of the many classes that we offer. I'm sure many of you seen, might as well start announcing it, July 11th, we're having our 13th annual Jewish Medical Ethics, conference. On the first 11 years, of course, we're a weekend away. Last year we went online, and this year too, for Bar Mitzvah year online. That's really a wonderful day. Those who have attended know it's really top of the line. So you can see it on the website. The details there, I believe, are 8 speakers. We have a morning session and an evening session. Avraham Steinberg and Aaron Glad, Eddie Reichman, David Pelkowitz, Mark Dratch. It's really a wonderful array of programming. So we invite you to come, and look forward to learning with you. And everybody be well, be safe. And thank you, Shulie. And say hi. Thank you for listening. We've got next year, please God, our third son is coming to Yeshivat Har Etzion. Of course, our daughter's
Beautiful.
in now as we speak. So, anyway, so our 2 older boys went, and our 2 daughters to Migdal Oz, and now number 5 going to Gush Etzion. We didn't tell any of them where to go to Yeshiva. They all could choose on their own, but what can I say? Anyway.
They want the best.
Yeah. So
all right.
I'll tell them to come and visit, but okay, anyways.
They're welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, wonderful share.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating as always.
Thank you.